In 1991, on the highway of death, where thousands burned in a fiery massacre, Delta Team heard the screams. Screams that weren't human, screams that followed them through the smoke. What they uncovered would haunt them for decades. Let's step into the darkness of the fateful night with Delta Team. Highway 80 stretched before them like a wound carved into the desert. A 60-mile scar of twisted metal and charred remains that had once been tanks, trucks, and the men inside them. The 6-lane thoroughfare connecting Kuwait to Iraq had earned a new name in the aftermath of coalition airstrikes just weeks earlier: the Highway of Death. Sergeant James Jim Carter squinted against the harsh March sun as their Humvee crawled past another burned-out hulk. At 35, the lines around his eyes had deepened during his 15 years of service. Panama, Grenada, and now the Gulf. He'd seen death before, but never on this industrial scale. "Jesus Christ, Private," Mark Daniels whispered from the passenger seat, his voice barely audible over the Humvee's engine. At 22, he was the youngest of their 4-man reconnaissance unit. "They're still in there, Sarge." Jim didn't need to look to know what Daniels had seen. Carbonized remains fused to seats and steering wheels. The aftermath of what military press officers were calling a turkey shoot. "Eyes forward, Daniels," Jim said, his voice flat. "We've got 10 more miles to patrol before sunset." Daniels nodded, but his hand moved to the tape recorder in his vest pocket, a motion Jim had noticed with increasing frequency. The kid had been documenting everything since they'd crossed into Kuwait, claiming he was gathering material for a book he'd write someday. From the back seat, Corporal Rob Hayes cleared his throat. "Sir, remind me again why we're out here counting corpses? War's over, isn't it? Hussein's boys either surrendered—" Jim adjusted his grip on the steering wheel. "Command wants confirmation that there are no stragglers, no survivors planning counterattacks. Plus, intel suggests some Iraqi officers might have escaped with sensitive materials." He left out the classified portion of their briefing, a single paragraph about auditory anomalies reported by previous patrols, quickly dismissed as atmospheric disturbances in the heavily redacted document. Just enough information to make Jim wonder if they were being sent as test subjects rather than a recon unit. The 4th member of their unit, Specialist Thomas Wilson, hadn't spoken since they'd entered the highway. He sat behind Daniels, his eyes fixed on the desolation outside, M16 resting across his lap. The Humvee rolled past a Soviet-made T-72 tank, its turret blown completely off and lying upside down 30 feet away. The sand around the wreckage had been turned to glass by the intense heat. "February 26th to 27th, Daniels said suddenly, flipping through his notebook. "That's when it happened. Coalition aircraft and ground forces just hammered this convoy for hours." He clicked his recorder on. "Note, some reports indicate civilians mixed in with military vehicles." "They shouldn't have been here," Hayes replied tersely. "Everyone knew what was coming." "Our job isn't to debate policy, gentlemen," Jim said. "Our job is to secure this area." The radio crackled to life, startling them all. "Delta Team, this is base. Check-in time, 1600 hours. Report status, over." Jim reached for the handset. "Base, Delta Team. Currently at checkpoint Alpha 7, continuing patrol as ordered. No contact, no significant findings. Next check-in at 1800, over." "Copy that, Delta. Be advised, sandstorm conditions possible within next 12 hours. Maintain regular comms, over." "Understood, base. Delta out." As Jim replaced the handset, the Humvee's engine sputtered suddenly, then died. The vehicle rolled to a stop in the middle of the highway. "The hell?" Jim muttered, turning the key. The engine cranked but wouldn't catch. "Fuel's good," Wilson observed, checking the gauge. "Temperature normal." Jim tried again. Nothing. "Pop the hood," he ordered, reaching for his sidearm out of habit before exiting the vehicle. The four men gathered around the Humvee's open hood, finding nothing visibly wrong with the engine. The desert had gone eerily quiet. No birds, no insects, no distant sounds of other military vehicles. Just silence and the occasional creak of cooling metal from the wrecks surrounding them. "Try it now, Sarge," Hayes suggested after checking the connections. Jim slid back behind the wheel and turned the key. The engine roared to life immediately, as if nothing had happened. "Weird," Daniels muttered, already reaching for his recorder. As they resumed their patrol, the sun began its descent, casting long shadows from the wrecked vehicles across the highway. The temperature would drop soon. Desert nights were merciless in their cold, just as the days were in their heat. The radio emitted a burst of static, then fell silent. Through the speakers came the tinny voice of a news anchor. "Coalition forces have successfully concluded what military analysts are calling the most precise surgical campaign in modern warfare. General Schwarzkopf stated today that every effort was made to minimize civilian casualties." "I didn't turn that on," Jim said, reaching for the dial. Before he could touch it, the broadcast dissolved into static. And through that static came something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. A sound, distant and faint, but unmistakable. A high, keening wail that rose and fell like someone or something in terrible pain. "Sir," Wilson finally spoke, his voice oddly tight. "Do you hear that?" Jim slowed the Humvee, listening. The sound came again, clearer now, a wailing cry that seemed to carry on the desert wind. "Probably just air moving through the wrecks," Jim said, though he didn't entirely believe it. He'd been in enough combat zones to know the sounds wind could make. This was different. "That's not wind," Daniel said, already reaching for his tape recorder. "That's a human voice." "Put that away," Jim ordered. "And it's just the metal contracting as the temperature drops. Physics, not ghosts." Hayes laughed, but it sounded forced. "Who said anything about ghosts, Sarge? Daniel's here thinking we're in some kind of horror flick?" The sound came again, louder this time, less like wind and more like a tortured cry. It lingered for several seconds before fading. Jim pulled the Humvee to a stop. "Wilson, Hayes, perimeter check. Daniels, radio check with base. Let them know our position." The men exited the vehicle, weapons ready, moving with the practiced precision of soldiers who had trained together for months. The highway stretched empty in both directions, the setting sun painting the destruction in hues of crimson and gold. "Clear left," Hayes called. "Clear right," Wilson echoed. Jim surveyed the landscape, trying to identify the source of the sound. Nothing moved except dust devils swirling between the wrecks. Daniels fiddled with the radio, getting nothing but static. "Comms are spotty, Sarge. Must be atmospheric interference." "Keep trying," Jim ordered, walking a few paces from the Humvee. The desert was quiet now. Jim had seen death before, in Panama, in Grenada, but never on this scale. The highway of death wasn't just a military victory. It was a tableau of destruction that defied comprehension. Thousands of vehicles, hundreds, perhaps thousands of lives extinguished in hours of relentless bombing. The keening wail came again, and this time there was no mistaking it for wind or metal. It was a human sound, filled with such anguish that Jim felt it in his chest like a physical blow. What the hell was that? Hayes had his M16 raised, scanning the horizon. "There's nobody out there," Wilson said, his voice steady but his eyes wide. "I've got a clear line of sight for half a mile in every direction." Jim felt a cold that had nothing to do with a desert evening. "Daniels, any luck with that radio?" "Negative, Sarge. Just static." The wailing came again, closer this time, seeming to emanate from a cluster of vehicles about 100 yards ahead. "We're going to check it out," Jim decided, pushing aside his unease. "Standard formation, weapons ready, but safety's on. Could be a wounded civilian or soldier." "After 3 weeks?" Hayes muttered skeptically. "Nobody survives out here that long without water." "Nevertheless," Jim replied firmly, "we check. That's our job." They approached the wrecked vehicles cautiously. 3 troop transports and what appeared to be a civilian bus, all burned beyond recognition. The smell hit them first: charred metal, melted plastic, and beneath it all, the unmistakable sweet, sour stench of decaying human remains. "Jesus!" Daniels gagged, pulling his bandana up over his nose and mouth, but still managed to keep his recorder running. "Stay focused," Jim ordered, though he too fought the urge to recoil from the smell. "Wilson, Hayes, check the transports. Daniels, with me on the bus." As they separated, Jim felt a strange reluctance to approach the bus. Something about it seemed wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. The windows were blown out, the metal skeleton blackened, but it wasn't the destruction that bothered him. It was the feeling that something was watching them from inside. "Sarge," Daniels whispered as they approached, "I don't think we should—" The wail cut through the air again, so close it seemed to reverberate inside Jim's skull. High and unnatural, it contained notes that no human throat should be able to produce. All 4 men instinctively raised their weapons, forming a defensive circle. "Where the hell is it coming from?" Hayes shouted, his earlier skepticism replaced by barely controlled panic. The sound faded, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. "It's just the wind," Jim said firmly, more for his men's benefit than because he believed it. "Or our minds playing tricks. We've all been on edge since the ground war ended." "That wasn't the wind, Sergeant," Wilson said quietly. "And it wasn't in our heads." Before Jim could respond, their radio crackled to life, making them all jump. "Recon Unit Delta, this is base. Come in, over." The voice was distorted but understandable. Jim grabbed the handset from Daniels. "This is Delta. We're approximately 20 miles into Highway 80, conducting sweep as ordered. We've encountered—" He paused, unsure how to describe what they'd heard without sounding unstable. "Unusual acoustic phenomena, possibly due to wind conditions or structural damage to vehicles. Requesting permission to continue patrol until scheduled extraction point." There was a long pause filled with static before the reply came. "Affirmative, Delta. Continue patrol. Be advised, missed check-in will trigger QRF deployment. Maintain comms check every 30 minutes. Over." "Understood. Delta out." Jim returned the handset to Daniels, meeting the questioning looks of his men with a stern expression. "We continue as planned. Whatever we heard, we documented objectively and move on. Clear?" "Clear," they responded in unison, though none looked convinced. As they returned to the Humvee, the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the highway into deepening shadows. Jim couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched by unseen eyes from every blackened vehicle they passed. "This place," Daniel said quietly as they climbed back into the Humvee. "It's like a graveyard nobody bothered to consecrate." Jim started the engine but didn't immediately put the vehicle in gear. He looked out at the darkening highway stretching before them, at the silhouettes of destruction becoming indistinguishable from the night. "It's a road," he said finally. "Just a road with some bad memories. Let's keep moving." But as they drove deeper into the gathering darkness of the highway of death, the tortured cries came again, distant but unmistakable. And despite his words, Jim Carter knew in his bones that they were traveling a road to something far worse than ruin. The sun had fully surrendered to darkness by the time they reached the heart of the destruction. Moonlight cast everything in a silvery luminescence that somehow made the carnage even more surreal. Twisted metal gleaming like bones, shattered glass sparkling like scattered diamonds across the asphalt. 3 clicks to the extraction point, Jim announced, checking the coordinates on his map. "We'll set up camp near that ridge and continue at first light." The Humvee's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating a particularly dense cluster of destroyed vehicles ahead. What had once been an Iraqi military convoy, mostly Soviet-built Zeal, 131 trucks, and a few BMPs, was now a macabre sculpture garden of blackened chassis and collapsed frames. "Hold up!" Hayes said suddenly, pointing toward a flicker of movement among the wrecks. 10 o'clock, about 50 yards out. Jim killed the engine and doused the lights. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the cooling tick of the Humvee's engine. "Everyone saw that, right?" Daniels whispered, already reaching for his tape recorder despite Jim's earlier warning. "Stow that thing," Jim ordered, but with less conviction than before. "Hayes, Wilson, night vision. Let's see what we're dealing with." They deployed from the vehicle with practiced efficiency, NVGs casting the world in an eerie green glow. The convoy remnants looked even more ghoulish through the goggles, twisted shapes that seemed to shift and breathe in ways metal shouldn't. "Spread out, 10-meter intervals," Jim instructed. "Radio check every 60 seconds. The men fanned out, moving cautiously between the wrecks. Jim took point, his M16 at the ready, scanning methodically for any sign of movement. The desert night had grown unnaturally cold, his breath forming small clouds that dissipated into the darkness. As he moved between 2 destroyed trucks, a memory ambushed him. Panama, 1989. His unit clearing a neighborhood after intelligence reported enemy fighters. The small house they'd approached. The family inside, eating dinner when the first shots were fired. The father's hand still clutching his fork. The mother draped over her child. The official report later, all combatants. Jim blinked the image away, focusing on the present. "Delta 1, clear," he reported into his radio. "Delta 3, clear," Hayes confirmed. "Delta 4, clear," Wilson echoed. Daniels's voice came last, breathless with excitement. "Delta 2, I've got something. Northeast quadrant near the overturned APC. Movement and... Jesus Christ, Sarge. I'm recording this." Jim changed direction, moving quickly but cautiously toward Daniels's position. As he approached, he saw the private crouched behind a piece of armor plating, his tape recorder held out toward something Jim couldn't yet see. "Daniels, report," Jim demanded, dropping to one knee beside him. The young soldier's face was pale in the moonlight, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. "Look," he whispered, pointing. Between 2 destroyed vehicles, a thin column of smoke rose from the ground, not the black smoke of burning fuel or rubber, but a wispy, almost translucent gray that moved against the desert breeze. As Jim watched, the smoke began to coalesce, forming what appeared to be a human silhouette. "That's not possible," Jim muttered, blinking hard. The figure remained, becoming more defined. The outline of shoulders, a head, arms that hung at unnatural angles. It made no sound, but as it turned what should have been its face toward them, the tortured cries began again, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Delta Team, "Converge on my position," Jim ordered into his radio, his throat dry. The smoke figure drifted closer, leaving no footprints in the sand. Jim felt a cold that went beyond temperature, a primal fear that bypassed rational thought. His weapon felt useless in his hands. Hayes' voice came from behind as he and Wilson arrived, weapons trained on the apparition. "I don't know," Jim admitted, "but it's not hostile yet. Hold your fire." Daniels continued recording, his hands trembling visibly. "February 27th, 1991, he narrated quietly. "Approximately 2,200 hours. We are witnessing what appears to be..." The smoke figure suddenly dispersed, scattering like mist before a gust of wind. The cries stopped as abruptly as they had begun, leaving only the desert silence. "What appears to be nothing," Hayes finished sarcastically, but his voice lacked its usual edge. "Daniels, you're losing it." "You all saw it," Daniels protested, rewinding his tape. "And I got the sounds. Listen." He pressed play. The tape hissed with static, but underneath was a sound that made them all tense. A warbling, distorted wail that rose and fell in patterns too regular to be wind, too agonized to be anything but human. "Could be interference," Hayes suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Desert plays tricks on electronics." "And on our eyes?" Wilson asked quietly. "Because I saw it too." Jim took the recorder from Daniels, listening intently. There was something else beneath the cries, words, perhaps, in a language he didn't recognize. "We need to check the rest of this convoy," he decided, handing the recorder back. "Something happened here beyond the obvious." "With all due respect, Sarge," Hayes objected, "we're not equipped for ghost hunting." "Our orders." "Our orders are to investigate anything unusual," Jim cut him off. "I'd say this qualifies." As Hayes opened his mouth to argue further, the lights on their radios began to flicker. The air around them seemed to thicken, carrying a faint scent of ozone. Static electricity made the hairs on their arms stand up. "Something's happening," Wilson warned, scanning the area through his NVGs. They split into pairs, Jim with Daniels, Hayes with Wilson, and began a systematic search of the destroyed convoy. The night remained quiet for nearly an hour as they documented serial numbers, checked for sensitive materials, and photographed the destruction. Jim was examining the remains of what appeared to be a communications truck when Daniels called him over. "Sarge, you need to see this." In the sand beside one of the vehicles, partially buried, was a small leather-bound book. Its cover was scorched, but the pages inside remained intact. Arabic script filled the pages, along with what looked like hand-drawn maps. "Officer's diary, maybe," Jim suggested, carefully placing it in an evidence bag. "Intelligence will want to see this." As his finger closed around the book, the cries returned, so loud and so close that Jim dropped to his knees, hands instinctively moving to cover his ears. Daniels did the same, his face contorted in pain. "Make it stop!" the young private shouted. The sound intensified, becoming not just a wail but a cacophony of voices, all crying out in different tones and pitches. And within the noise, Jim began to make out words, English words, repeated over and over. "See us. Hear us." As suddenly as it had begun, the noise ceased. Jim found himself on all fours, breathing heavily, cold sweat running down his face. Daniels was curled in a fetal position beside him, the tape recorder still clutched in his hand. "Daniels," Jim gasped, shaking the private's shoulder. "You okay?" The young man nodded shakily, sitting up. Did you understand what they were saying?" Before Jim could answer, Hayes and Wilson came running, weapons ready. "What happened?" Hayes demanded. "We heard you shouting!" Jim stood slowly, retrieving the evidence bag with the book. "We found something, and I think it found us too." Back at the Humvee, they established a perimeter and set up a small camp. No one suggested continuing to the extraction point. An unspoken agreement had formed that they wouldn't travel that highway in darkness. Hayes busied himself with checking weapons, his earlier skepticism having evolved into a tense silence. Wilson monitored the radio, reporting the increasingly frequent static as normal desert interference. Daniels sat apart from the others, repeatedly playing back his recordings, headphones clamped tightly over his ears. Jim sat alone, the diary in his hands, unable to read the Arabic but transfixed by the diagrams and maps. One page showed what was unmistakably Highway 80, with markings along its length. Another contained a drawing of what looked like a man with his mouth open, impossibly wide, lines radiating from it suggesting sound or energy. "This is crazy," he muttered to himself. "There's a rational explanation." But as he stared out at the moonlit graveyard of vehicles stretching in both directions, Jim Carter knew he was lying to himself. In 15 years of military service, he'd never encountered anything like the phenomena on this highway, and deep in his gut, a terrible certainty was growing. The cries they heard were from the dead of the highway of death, and for some reason, they needed to be heard. In the distance, a shadow moved between wrecked vehicles, too solid to be smoke, too fluid to be human. Jim watched it, his hand tightening on his sidearm as the first traces of doubt about his own sanity crept into his mind. The radio crackled suddenly, startling them all. "Delta Team, this is Base. You've missed your 2200 check-in. Report status immediately. Over." Jim grabbed the handset. "Base, this is Delta. Sorry about the missed check-in. We're approximately 3 clicks from extraction point. Setting up camp due to difficult terrain navigation at night. We'll resume at first light. Over." The reply came through layers of static. "Copy that, Delta. Be advised, Command is requesting immediate report on any unusual findings. Repeat, any unusual findings to be reported directly to Colonel Hadley. Over." Jim hesitated, looking at his men. Hayes shook his head slightly. Wilson remained expressionless. Daniels, still wearing his headphones, hadn't even heard the transmission. "Nothing significant to report at this time, Base. We'll provide full debrief at extraction. Delta out." As Jim set the handset down, Hayes moved closer. "They know something," he said quietly. "That bit about unusual findings. They're fishing." "Maybe," Jim agreed. "Or maybe they're just following protocol." "Bullshit," Hayes replied. "That redacted report you mentioned before we left, what exactly did it say about auditory anomalies?" Jim sighed. "Not much. Just that previous patrols reported hearing voices or screams. Command dismissed it as wind through wreckage or psychological stress." "And sent us out here anyway," Wilson added, joining the conversation, "without warning us." "Like lab rats," Hayes muttered. Jim had no answer for that. The thought had occurred to him as well, that perhaps their mission had purposes beyond simple reconnaissance. Daniels finally removed his headphones, his expression troubled. "Sarge, I've been analyzing the recordings. The voices, they're saying the same phrases over and over in different languages. English, Arabic, what sounds like Farsi." "What phrases?" Jim asked. "See us, hear us." Daniels hesitated. "And something that sounds like witness." The 4 men fell silent, each contemplating the implications. The highway stretched dark and silent around them, but now they all understood it wasn't empty. Whatever presence inhabited this place, it had found them, marked them. "Get some rest," Jim finally ordered. 2-hour watch rotations. I'll take first, then Hayes, Wilson, Daniels. We move at first light. As his men settled in for what rest they could find, Jim positioned himself at the perimeter, rifle across his lap. The highway of death lived up to its name in ways none of them could have anticipated. And somehow Jim knew their real ordeal was just beginning. Sleep came in fitful bursts for Delta Team. They had established a watch rotation. Jim took first shift, followed by Hayes, Wilson, and finally Daniels. But even when off duty, true rest proved elusive. The desert night had grown unnaturally cold, forcing them to huddle near a small, carefully shielded heat source. Jim sat on the hood of the Humvee, scanning the darkness through his night vision goggles. The highway stretched before him like a museum of destruction frozen in time. Nothing moved except the occasional desert hare darting between wrecks. "You seeing anything out there, Sarge?" Wilson asked quietly from where he sat cleaning his sidearm. "Nothing that shouldn't be there," Jim replied, though the qualification was telling. The entire highway felt wrong, like a wound that wouldn't close, festering in the desert night. Wilson nodded, returning to his task with methodical precision. "Hayes thinks Daniels is cracking up. Says the kid's been listening to those recordings for hours." Jim glanced toward where Daniels sat, huddled in his sleeping bag, headphones still on, scribbling frantically in his notebook. The private had barely spoken since their encounter with the smoke figure. "He's processing," Jim said. "We all cope differently." "And how are you coping, Sarge?" Wilson asked, looking up with knowing eyes. Jim didn't answer immediately. At 35, he'd seen more combat than the others combined. Panama, Grenada, and now the Gulf. He'd witnessed death in many forms, but nothing had prepared him for the highway of death or the unnatural phenomena they'd encountered. "I'm keeping an open mind," he said finally, "and a clear head." Wilson nodded, holstering his weapon. "Reminds me of something that happened in my grandfather's unit in Vietnam. They were patrolling near a village that had been napalmed. Said they heard voices for weeks afterward, calling out names, pleading for help." "What did they do?" Jim asked, genuinely curious. "Most of them started drinking heavily," Wilson admitted. "Except my grandfather. He started leaving offerings, water, rice, small items. Said the voices got quieter after that." Jim considered this, his eyes still scanning the darkness. "You think we're dealing with the same thing? Ghosts?" Wilson shrugged. "I think violent death leaves something behind. Call it ghosts, call it energy, call it collective guilt. Whatever it is, it's real enough to those who experience it." The conversation lapsed into silence. Jim checked his watch. 0200 hours. Hayes would relieve him soon. "Try to get some sleep," he told Wilson. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." As Wilson retreated to his sleeping bag, Jim continued his vigilant watch. The moon had risen higher, casting longer shadows among the wrecked vehicles. In the silvery light, it was easier to imagine the highway as it had been during the attack, filled with men trying desperately to escape the rain of fire from above. His thoughts drifted to a mission in Panama 4 years earlier. His unit had been tasked with clearing a neighborhood of Noriega loyalists. Intelligence had reported armed resistance, but what they found instead were mostly civilians, including a family that had been eating dinner when the first shots were fired. Jim had entered the house to find them still seated around the table, bodies riddled with bullets from overzealous soldiers in the unit ahead of his. The memory had haunted him for years. The father's hand still clutching his fork, the mother's body draped protectively over her youngest child. Jim had reported the incident, but nothing came of it. Collateral damage, they called it. Unavoidable in urban combat. A sound pulled him from his reverie. Faint at first, like the whisper of sand against metal, then growing louder. The tortured cries had returned, but different this time. A single voice rather than many, deep and resonant with an almost mechanical quality. Jim stood, scanning the perimeter with his NVGs. Nothing moved, yet the sound continued, seeming to circle their position like a predator. "Hayes," he called softly, not wanting to wake the others yet. "You hearing this?" No response. Jim turned to find Hayes' sleeping bag empty. The corporal was supposed to be preparing to take over watch, but he was nowhere in sight. "Hayes, report," Jim said into his radio, keeping his voice calm despite the growing unease in his gut. Static answered him, punctuated by what sounded like labored breathing. Jim moved quickly to wake Wilson and Daniels. "Hayes is missing. Full alert." They assembled with practiced efficiency, weapons ready, forming a defensive triangle around their camp. "Did anyone see him leave?" Jim asked. "He said he was going to check the perimeter before his watch," Wilson reported. "That was about 20 minutes ago." The crying had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence broken only by their own breathing. "Spread out," Jim ordered. 10-meter search pattern. Radio check every 30 seconds. They moved outward from the camp, NVGs painting the world in ghostly green. Jim took the western quadrant, where the convoy they'd been investigating earlier stretched into darkness. "Delta 4, clear," Wilson reported. "Delta 2, clear," Daniels echoed, his voice steadier than it had been earlier. Jim approached the command truck they'd examined before, his senses heightened to painful acuity. Something was different about it now. A faint glow emanated from the shattered cab, too steady to be reflected moonlight. "Delta 1, investigating possible light source at the command vehicle," he reported. As he drew closer, the glow intensified, a pale, bluish illumination that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of a heartbeat. Jim raised his weapon, moving in a crouch to approach from the blind side of the truck. The tortured cry began again, just as he rounded the vehicle's rear, a single, sustained howl of agony that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. Jim fought the instinct to cover his ears, maintaining his grip on his weapon as he cleared the corner. What he saw froze him in place. Hovering, beside the truck's cab was a figure that defied rational explanation. It had the general shape of a man in military uniform, but its edges were blurred, its substance translucent. Where its face should have been was a gaping black hole, stretched impossibly wide in a silent scream that somehow produced the terrible sound filling the night. And kneeling before it, as if in supplication, was Hayes. "Hayes!" Jim shouted, raising his weapon. "Get down!" The corporal didn't move, didn't even seem to hear. His eyes were fixed on the apparition, his expression one of terrified fascination. The ghostly figure turned toward Jim, its mouth hole widening further. The crying intensified, becoming a physical force that pushed against him like a desert wind. "Delta 1, contact!" Jim shouted into his radio, though he had no words to describe what he was seeing. "Hayes is down! Possible hostile!" He fired a warning shot over the apparition's head. The bullet passed through it without effect, striking a piece of wreckage beyond with a metallic ping. The ghost, because Jim could no longer deny that's what it was, drifted closer to Hayes. Tendrils of its vaporous substance reaching toward the kneeling soldier, Jim charged forward, abandoning protocol. "Hayes, snap out of it!" He tackled the corporal, breaking whatever connection had formed between him and the apparition. They tumbled to the ground as the ghost let out another piercing cry, this one clearly expressing rage. "Run!" Jim shouted, pulling Hayes to his feet. The corporal moved like a sleepwalker, his eyes unfocused. The ghost pursued, moving with unnatural speed, its mouth hole continuing to emit that terrible sound. Jim half-dragged Hayes back toward their camp, firing another burst over his shoulder, more from instinct than any hope it would help. Wilson and Daniels had heard the commotion and were racing to intercept, weapons ready. "Fire in the air!" Jim ordered. "Make noise!" They obeyed without question, sending a barrage of bullets skyward. The combined sound of their weapons momentarily drowned out the crying. The ghost faltered, its form becoming less distinct, then scattered like smoke in a strong wind. Silence fell, broken only by their heavy breathing and the distant echo of their gunfire. "What the hell was that?" Daniels gasped, his tape recorder already in his hand. Hayes had collapsed to his knees again, his face ashen. It was talking to me," he whispered. "What did it say?" Jim asked, helping the corporal back to his feet. Hayes looked up, his eyes haunted. "It said we're all guilty. It said the highway remembers." Back at the camp, they established a tighter perimeter, no one suggesting they try to sleep again. Hayes sat wrapped in a thermal blanket, still shivering despite the heat pack in his hands. "I couldn't resist it," he explained, his voice hollow. "I was checking the perimeter and heard someone calling for help, in English. I thought maybe we'd missed a survivor somehow." He laughed bitterly. "Stupid, right? After 3 weeks?" "What happened when you found it?" Jim pressed. Hayes shook his head. "It was like it reached inside my head, showed me things, the attack from their perspective, being trapped in the vehicles, the bombs falling, the dying." He looked up, his eyes wet. "It was trying to make me understand something." "Understand what?" Wilson asked. "That we're connected to this place now, that it won't let us leave until we acknowledge what happened here." Daniels had been unusually quiet, but now he spoke up. "I've been transcribing the recordings," he said, holding up his notebook. "There are words in there, English, Arabic, even some Farsi. Most of it is just cries for help or water, but there's a phrase that keeps repeating, witness and remember." Jim took the notebook, scanning Daniels's meticulous transcription. The young private was right. Amid the chaos of recorded cries were clear phrases, pleas, and accusations. "This is insane," Wilson muttered. "We're talking about ghosts, like they're real." "You saw it," Hayes snapped. "We all did. And it's not just one. There are dozens, maybe hundreds of them out there. Everyone who died on this highway." Jim stood, making a decision. "We're moving out at first light. Whatever's happening here, we're not equipped to deal with it. We'll reach the extraction point, deliver our report, and let higher-ups decide what to do." "They'll think we've lost our minds," Wilson pointed out. Jim held up the evidence bag containing the diary they'd found. "We have this, and Daniels's recordings. It's more than just our word." "And if they come back before dawn?" Hayes asked, his eyes darting nervously to the darkness beyond their camp. Jim checked his watch. 0400 hours. The eastern sky would begin lightening in about 2 hours. "We maintain full alert," he said. "No one goes anywhere alone. And..." He hesitated, recalling Wilson's story. "We make an offering." The others looked at him in surprise. "An offering?" Hayes repeated. Jim nodded, his mind made up. "Water, food, whatever we can spare." Wilson's grandfather had the right idea in Vietnam. If these are the spirits of the dead, maybe they just want acknowledgement. They gathered what they could: water bottles, ration packs, even personal items like Hayes's lucky compass and Daniels's spare notebook. Jim placed them carefully at the edge of their perimeter, then stepped back. "I don't know if you can hear me," he said aloud, feeling slightly foolish but pushing through it. "But we see you, we hear you, and we remember what happened here." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a gentle breeze stirred the sand around the offerings, despite the air being completely still elsewhere. The items shifted slightly as if being examined by invisible hands. The men watched in stunned silence as one of the water bottles tipped over, its contents emptying into the sand. Instead of forming a puddle, the water flowed in distinct patterns, creating what looked like Arabic script before being absorbed into the ground. "What did it say?" Jim asked, looking at Daniels, who had been studying Arabic. The private swallowed hard. "It said, 'Not enough.'" The sky began to lighten almost imperceptibly in the east. Dawn was approaching, but Jim Carter had never felt further from the comfort of daylight. As he looked out at the highway stretching before them, he knew with terrible certainty that their ordeal was just beginning. The ghosts of the highway of death had found their witnesses, and they weren't going to let them go until their story was told. Dawn broke over the highway of death like a reluctant confession, spilling pale light across the wreckage. The men of Delta Team had survived the night, though none had slept since Hayes' encounter with the apparition. They sat in tense silence as Jim checked their coordinates on the map. "We're 8 clicks from the extraction point," he announced, folding the map with precision. "If we move now, we can be there by 0900. Hayes stared vacantly at the horizon, the night's events having hollowed something vital from behind his eyes. "They won't let us leave, Sarge." "We're not asking permission," Jim replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Pack up. We move in 5. As they dismantled their makeshift camp, Daniels continued to fiddle with his tape recorder, rewinding and playing segments with obsessive attention. The device had become an extension of him, a technological talisman against the horrors they'd witnessed. "Daniels," Jim called. "Time to go." The private looked up, his eyes bright with a feverish intensity. "You need to hear this, Sarge. I cleaned up the audio while you guys were prepping the Humvee." "Save it for the debrief," Jim ordered, but Daniels was already pressing play. The tape hissed with static, then cleared to reveal the now familiar crying. But beneath it, rendered audible by Daniels' audio filtering, were distinct words: Shahid, witness, Qutil bila rahma, killed without mercy. The voices overlapped, some in Arabic, others in halting English, creating a cacophony of accusations that made the men freeze in place. "American, see what you've done. Atfal, children, La Tunsina. Don't forget us." Jim felt the words like physical blows. "Turn it off." "There's more," Daniels insisted, his finger hovering over the stop button but not pressing it. "They're talking about specific places, specific incidents. This isn't random, Sarge. They're trying to tell us something." The recorder continued its ghastly playback. "Bus number 17, civilian. We were running away. Allah yashhadna. God witnesses us." Hayes suddenly lunged forward, snatching the recorder from Daniel's hands and hurling it to the ground. "Enough! We're not supposed to be here. We're not supposed to hear this." Wilson stepped between them as Daniels scrambled to retrieve his device. "Stand down, Corporal." "You're feeding it," Hayes accused, pointing a trembling finger at Daniels. "Every time you play that thing, you're making them stronger. Can't you see that?" Jim gripped Hayes by the shoulders, forcing the agitated soldier to look at him. "Get it together, Rob. We're leaving now. Whatever's happening here, we're going to report it through proper channels." Hayes' laugh was brittle, teetering on the edge of hysteria. "Proper channels? You think the brass wants to hear that the highway is haunted by the people we killed? That they're speaking to us? They weren't all enemy combatants, Daniel said quietly, cradling his recorder. That's what they're trying to tell us. There were civilians mixed in with a military convoy, refugees, families trying to flee. We know that already, Wilson interjected. The reports mentioned civilian casualties. Mentioned, sure, Daniels countered. But did they mention bus number 17? Did they count the children? A heavy silence fell over the group. The sun had climbed higher, promising heat that would soon become oppressive, but none of them moved toward the Humvee. Play it again, Jim finally said, his voice subdued. All of it. Daniels nodded, rewinding the tape. This time they all listened intently as the voices emerged from the static. Dozens of them, overlapping in a terrible chorus of remembrance. We surrendered. White flags. They kept firing. Alatfal, Kanut Yabkun. The children were crying. Highway becomes river. Blood flows north. Americans see only military targets. Remember us. Shahid. Witness. La Tunsina. Don't forget us. When the tape finished, Jim looked at each of his men in turn. Hayes had gone pale, his earlier anger replaced by a sick recognition. Wilson stood straight-backed but unable to meet anyone's eyes. Daniels alone seemed energized rather than depleted, his fingers already scribbling translations in his notebook. It's the same phrase at the end of each segment, he pointed out. Witness and remember. Like they need us to acknowledge what happened. They're accusing us, Hayes muttered. Making us into what? Confessors? Judges? Witnesses, Jim corrected, the word settling heavily in his chest. They want their story told. He walked a few paces away from the group, staring down the length of the highway. In the daylight, the destruction seemed more obscene somehow. The blackened hulks of vehicles, the personal items scattered across the asphalt, the occasional glimpse of something that had once been human. When he returned to the group, his decision was made. We're going to investigate bus number 17. Sarge, Wilson began to protest. That's an order, Specialist. We find the bus, document what's there, and then we leave. Clear? The men nodded reluctantly. Daniels, you have the coordinates from the tape? The private consulted his notes. Based on what they're saying, it should be about 3 clicks north of here, part of a civilian convoy that got mixed in with a military retreat. They loaded into the Humvee in silence, each man lost in his own thoughts as Jim navigated around the wreckage littering the highway. The sun climbed higher, turning the destroyed vehicles into blackened islands in a sea of shimmering heat. There, Daniel said after 20 minutes of driving, that collection of vehicles off to the right. Jim steered toward the indicated spot, where several civilian vehicles, minibuses, cars, and pickup trucks had been caught in the same deadly barrage as the military transports around them. The destruction was total, with nothing left untouched by fire and explosives. Bus 17 would be a minibus based on the Iraqi civilian transport numbering system, Daniels explained as they exited the Humvee, probably carrying 15 to 20 people. They spread out, searching through the wreckage. The crying that had haunted them through the night was absent, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to watch their every move. Here, Wilson called after several minutes. I found a bus with a partial number. Could be 17. They converged on his position. The vehicle was barely recognizable as a bus, its frame twisted and collapsed, its windows blown out. Scorched metal revealed where the number plate had once been. Only the digit 7 remained visible. This is it, Daniel said with certainty, his recorder already running. I can feel it. Jim approached cautiously, peering into the ruined interior. What he saw made him step back involuntarily, a curse escaping his lips. Inside were the remains of at least a dozen people, their bodies fused to seats or to each other by the intense heat of whatever had struck the bus. In the back, a smaller collection of bodies, unmistakably children, were huddled together in what must have been a final, futile attempt at protection. "Jesus Christ," Wilson whispered, crossing himself despite not being religious. Hayes stood frozen, his face a mask of horror. They were civilians, all of them. "Command would have known," Daniels said, his voice hollow as he recorded everything. "The planes would have seen they weren't military vehicles." Jim said nothing, his eyes fixed on a partially preserved backpack lying amid the destruction. Faded cartoon characters smiled grotesquely from its charred surface. Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, universal symbols of childhood innocence. As he stared at the backpack, another memory from Panama surfaced. A child's school bag he'd found in the aftermath of their mistaken raid, its contents scattered across a blood-stained floor. He'd pocketed a small drawing from it, stick figures of a family holding hands, and kept it folded in his wallet for years as a private penance. A soft moan snapped Jim back to the present. It had come from deeper inside the bus. "Did you hear that?" he asked, already moving forward. "Sarge, there can't be," Hayes began. "I heard it too," Wilson confirmed, following Jim. They pushed deeper into the wreckage, moving carefully around the remains. In the back of the bus, partially sheltered by what had once been the restroom compartment, lay a man. His clothes were burned, his skin blistered and peeling, but incredibly, his chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. "He's alive!" Jim gasped. "Daniels, med kit, now!" They worked quickly, assessing the man's injuries. He was elderly, perhaps in his 60s, with a once dignified beard now singed and patchy. His eyes fluttered open as Jim administered morphine, revealing dark irises clouded with pain. "Ma, Ma," the man whispered. "Water," Daniels translated, already uncapping his canteen. They helped the man drink, though Jim knew it was futile. The injuries were too severe, the dehydration too advanced. No one could have survived 3 weeks in these conditions. And yet, somehow, this man had. "Ask him who he is," Jim instructed Daniels. "What happened here?" Daniels spoke in halting Arabic, leaning close to hear the man's faint responses. "He says his name is Dr. Mahmoud al-Rashid," Daniels reported. "He was a physician in Kuwait City. When the invasion came, he tried to evacuate with his family, his wife, 2 daughters, and 3 grandchildren." The man spoke again, more urgently now, clutching at Daniels' sleeve. "He says they were told to follow the military convoy by Iraqi soldiers. They had no choice." Daniels listened to more labored Arabic. "They were waving white flags from the windows when the planes came." "F-15E Strike Eagles," Wilson said quietly. "Night attack capability. They would have seen the bus shape was different from military vehicles." The dying man's eyes found Jim's, recognition dawning in them despite the language barrier. He spoke directly to Jim now, his voice stronger than seemed possible. "He says," Daniels translated haltingly, "he says he's been waiting for someone to come. That the others wouldn't let him die until someone heard their story." "The others?" Hayes asked, looking around nervously. As if in answer, the temperature around them plummeted. The air inside the bus grew thick, charged with static electricity. And then the voices began, not from Daniels' recorder, but from the air around them, soft at first, then building in intensity. "Witness, remember, tell our story." The words came in multiple languages, but their meaning was unmistakable. Unlike the inhuman cries of the night before, these voices were plaintive, almost conversational. The voices of people rather than tortured spirits. "We were fleeing Kuwait. Iraqi soldiers told us to follow. We had no choice. My children in the back. I told them to stay down. The planes came so fast. We waved white flags. They kept firing." Hayes dropped to his knees, hands pressed against his ears. "Make it stop!" "We hear you," Jim said aloud, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. "We witness what happened here." The voices continued, but they shifted in tone, becoming less accusatory and more informative, as if encouraged by Jim's acknowledgement. "Not just here, all along the highway. Hundreds of us, mixed with the soldiers. Find the book. It tells the truth. The diary in the sand." Jim remembered the scorched diary they'd found the previous day. He retrieved it from his pack, opening it carefully. The Arabic script remained indecipherable to him, but the hand-drawn maps now made more sense. They showed civilian convoys interspersed with military ones. "Daniels," he called. "Can you read any of this?" The private took the diary, scanning its pages with growing excitement. It's a field journal kept by an Iraqi civil defense officer. He was documenting the evacuation of Kuwaiti civilians and Iraqi military personnel. Daniels flipped through more pages. He knew they were being targeted. He tried to separate the civilian vehicles, but there wasn't time. So he documented everything instead, Jim concluded. Names, dates, locations. "Evidence," Daniels agreed. "This is what they want us to find, to preserve." The voices had grown quieter, as if listening to their conversation. When they spoke again, it was a single voice, deeper, more authoritative. "Now you understand. We are not the enemy. We are the forgotten, the misidentified, the collateral." Hayes looked up, his face streaked with tears. "We didn't know. I swear to God, we didn't know. Some knew, some didn't care, some followed orders. All are responsible." Dr. al-Rashid's breathing had become more labored. He spoke again, his eyes fixed on the diary in Daniels's hands. "He says the officer who kept that diary was his friend," Daniels translated. "They planned the evacuation together. The officer promised to record everything, no matter what happened." The dying man reached for Jim's hand, gripping it with surprising strength. His final words came in accented English. "Justice begins with truth. Truth begins with witness. You will be our witnesses." His hand went slack, his eyes staring sightlessly at the ruined ceiling of the bus. The last survivor of Bus 17 had joined the dead. As Jim gently closed the man's eyes, the voices faded, leaving behind an echo that seemed to reverberate across the highway. In their place came the familiar crying, distant now, but unmistakable in its anguish. "They're everywhere," Wilson realized aloud. "All along the highway. Different stories, different deaths." "And they all want to be heard," Daniels added, still recording. Jim closed the diary, his decision made. "We continue to the extraction point, but we take everything with us, the recordings, the diary, photos, our testimony. Whatever happened here doesn't stay buried in the desert." Hayes stood shakily, his earlier skepticism completely eroded. "They won't believe us, Sarge. They'll say we're suffering from combat stress." "Maybe," Jim acknowledged, "but the evidence will speak for itself." As they walked back to the Humvee, the voices followed, not threatening now, but expectant, as if they had placed their trust in these 4 soldiers to carry their stories forward. "You know what this means," Wilson said quietly to Jim. "If what they're saying is true, if civilians were deliberately targeted, or if commanders knew they were mixed in with military—" "War crimes," Jim finished for him. "I know." The weight of that knowledge hung over them as they drove north, toward the extraction point and whatever awaited them beyond the highway of death. The cries continued to echo across the desert, but now they understood what the voices had been trying to tell them all along. They weren't just haunting the highway, they were testifying. The Humvee's engine strained as they navigated around a particularly dense cluster of wreckage. Jim checked his watch, 0930 hours, and they were still 2 kilometers from the extraction point. The voices had followed them, ebbing and flowing like radio signals caught between stations, sometimes clear enough to make out individual words, other times merging into that terrible chorus of anguish. "Sarge, look!" Wilson pointed ahead to where the highway curved around a low ridge. "Something's there!" Jim slowed the vehicle, squinting against the harsh sunlight. A dark shape lay across the road, too uniform to be wreckage, too large to be a fallen road sign. "Is that sandbags?" Hayes asked, leaning forward from the back seat. As they drew closer, Jim felt his stomach tighten. The road ahead was clear, completely empty. Then, before their eyes, debris began to lift from the surrounding desert. Twisted metal, shattered glass, and scorched personal effects floated through the air, assembling themselves into a makeshift roadblock that stretched the entire width of the highway. "Holy shit," Wilson whispered. Within seconds, the barrier had fully formed, a wall of salvaged wreckage too substantial to drive over or around. Metal pieces weren't randomly arranged, but formed patterns resembling Arabic calligraphy. Embedded within the structure were children's toys, family photographs, identity cards, all charred but recognizable. "That wasn't there yesterday," Jim said, bringing the Humvee to a stop 50 meters from the obstruction. "And it sure as hell didn't build itself just now." "Except it did," Daniels murmured, his recorder already running. "They don't want us to leave." They exited the vehicle cautiously, weapons at the ready. The desert heat had intensified, creating shimmering waves above the asphalt that made the roadblock appear to undulate like a living thing. "Wilson, Hayes, check the perimeter," Jim ordered. "Daniels, with me." Jim approached the barrier, noting how the metal pieces twisted into flowing script. As he reached out to touch one section, condensation formed on its surface, droplets arranging themselves into English words, "Not yet." "Sarge!" Hayes called from the eastern edge of the roadblock. "You need to see this." They joined Hayes, who stood staring at something half buried in the sand beside the highway. Jim knelt for a closer look and found himself face to face with an artifact that seemed out of place amid the modern destruction. It was a stone tablet approximately 2 feet square, its surface carved with symbols that resembled no alphabet Jim recognized. The stone itself appeared ancient, weathered and cracked with age, yet it had been deliberately placed here, partially exposed as if waiting to be discovered. "What the hell is that?" Wilson asked, joining them. "It's not Arabic," Daniels said, photographing the tablet. "Not Farsi either. It looks older." Jim brushed sand from the surface, revealing more of the strange symbols. As his fingers traced the carvings, the air around them changed, growing heavier, charged with static electricity that made the hairs on their arms stand on end. "Back up," Jim ordered, suddenly uneasy. "Everyone back to the Humvee. Now." They had taken only a few steps when the tortured cries began again, not from all around them as before, but emanating directly from the tablet. The sound rose in pitch and volume until it became physically painful, driving them to their knees. And then, as abruptly as it had started, the crying stopped. In the ringing silence that followed, a single voice spoke, not in English or Arabic, but somehow understandable to all of them. "The highway has always been here. The highway has always known death." The air above the tablet shimmered, coalescing into the figure of a man dressed in robes that belonged to no modern culture. His face was gaunt, his eyes deep-set and knowing. "I am the first witness. There have been many after me. You will not be the last." "What is this place?" Jim managed to ask, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. Instead of answering, the figure raised a translucent hand. The world around them shifted, the modern wreckage vanishing, replaced by a vision of the same highway centuries earlier. A caravan of merchants lay slaughtered, their blood soaking into the sand as raiders divided their goods. The scene changed again. Ottoman soldiers marched along the route, ambushed by Bedouin fighters who materialized from the dunes. Jim could smell the gunpowder, hear the clash of steel, feel the desert heat as it had been in 1817. "A crossroads," the ancient witness finally said as the visions faded. "A boundary, a place where the veil between worlds thins when blood is spilled in sufficient quantity." He gestured along the highway. "Your war is but the latest harvest on this ancient road." Daniels had somehow maintained his grip on his recorder, capturing everything. "You're saying this highway is cursed?" The figure's expression might have been a smile, though it held no warmth. "Cursed, blessed, sacred, profane. Words change. Blood remains." Hayes stared at the apparition, his earlier fear replaced by a strange fascination. "The voices we've been hearing? They're all from the Gulf War? The highway of death?" "They are the loudest now because their deaths are recent. But listen deeper." The air filled with voices speaking languages Jim didn't recognize, ancient tongues that hadn't been heard in centuries. As the cacophony washed over him, Jim was suddenly elsewhere. Panama, 1989. He was entering that house again, seeing the family at their dinner table, riddled with bullets. But this time, he felt their terror, their confusion as the shooting began. The father's desperate attempt to shield his children. The mother's final prayer. Jim gasped, returning to the present. The ancient witness watched him with knowing eyes. "You have witnessed before," the figure observed. "Carried guilt before. This road has carried caravans, armies, refugees, and pilgrims since before your histories were written," the witness continued. "All have left their mark. All have fed the hunger of this place." "Are you saying this has happened before?" Jim asked, struggling to process what he was hearing. "That this highway collects deaths?" "It remembers them, as you must remember those who fell in your war." The figure began to fade, its outline blurring. "The tablet is a record, the first record. There have been many since. Your friend carries one now." Jim glanced at Daniels, who clutched the Iraqi officer's diary against his chest. "Complete the record, then you may leave." "How?" Jim demanded. "How do we complete it?" But the figure had vanished, leaving only the stone tablet half buried in the sand. The air gradually returned to normal, the oppressive weight lifting. Daniels was already flipping through the diary. If what that entity said is true, then this officer wasn't just documenting the current deaths. He was continuing a tradition that goes back centuries. "But why us?" Hayes asked. "Why is this happening to our unit?" Jim had no answer, but as he looked back at the roadblock, the memory of Panama surfaced again, stronger, more vivid. the cover-up that followed, his signature on the report that labeled all casualties as combatants. "Because we need to witness," he said quietly. "Because some of us have looked away before." Before anyone could respond, the tablet began to emit a low humming sound. The strange symbols carved into its surface started to glow with an inner light, pulsing like a heartbeat. "Get back!" Jim shouted, but it was too late. The light flared blindingly, and when they could see again, the highway around them had changed. The modern wreckage was gone, replaced by older vehicles, 1940s military transports and tanks bearing the insignia of the British Army. "What the hell?" Wilson gasped. Bodies lay scattered across the highway, soldiers in period uniforms, some British, others in the distinctive garb of local fighters. The desert wind carried the acrid smell of gunpowder and blood, all of it impossibly fresh. "It's showing us the past," Daniels realized, his recorder capturing everything. Back and back through time, each era bringing its own dead, its own silent plea for acknowledgement. Finally, the vision settled on what must have been the earliest period, men in primitive garb lying where they had fallen, their weapons made of bronze and stone. Among them walked the figure they had seen earlier, now more substantial, more real. He moved among the dead, marking symbols in the sand beside each body, the same symbols that adorned the tablet. "The first witness," Jim murmured. "The first recorder." The visions faded, the highway returning to its modern state with its burned-out vehicles from the Gulf War. The tablet's glow diminished, though it continued to pulse faintly. Hayes sat heavily on the ground, his face ashen. "What are we supposed to do with this? How do we complete the record?" Jim looked at the roadblock again, understanding dawning. "We need to document everything, not just what happened to the civilians in Bus 17, but all of it, the entire highway, every story we can find." "That could take days," Wilson protested. "Then it takes days," Jim replied firmly. "Command will have to wait for our extraction." "They'll send someone looking for us," Hayes pointed out. Jim nodded. "And they'll find the same roadblock we did. No one leaves until the highway is satisfied." "The highway wants witnesses. Real witnesses." As if in response to his words, the voices began again, louder than before, coming from all directions at once. The sound held a new urgency, a demand that couldn't be ignored. Jim made his decision. "We go back, set up camp at the bus site, document everything we can, and—" He hesitated. "And we open ourselves to whatever the highway wants to show us." Wilson and Hayes exchanged uneasy glances, but neither contradicted him. Daniel simply nodded, as if he'd expected nothing less. As they returned to the Humvee, Jim felt a presence behind him. He turned to find a figure standing at the roadblock, not the ancient witness this time, but a modern Iraqi man in civilian clothes, his form translucent in the desert sun. "I was a teacher," the figure said in accented English. "I taught mathematics in Kuwait City. My wife and 3 children were with me on the bus." Jim stopped, listening. "We believed we would be safe if we followed instructions. We waved white flags from the windows. The planes came anyway." The ghost's eyes held no accusation, only infinite sadness. "Will you tell them about us? Will you make them remember?" "Yes," Jim promised. "We'll tell your story. All of your stories." The figure nodded once, then faded from view. In his place stood dozens of other spectral forms, men, women, children, all watching the 4 soldiers with the same expectant gaze. The cries that had haunted them weren't meant to terrify. They were meant to ensure they could not look away, could not forget, could not leave without carrying the burden of remembrance. Behind them, the stone tablet continued to pulse in the sand, its rhythm matching the heartbeats of the 4 witnesses who would soon learn what it truly meant to walk the highway of death. The afternoon sun hung mercilessly over the highway of death as Delta Team established their new camp near Bus 17. Jim ordered a proper base setup, defensive perimeter, communication station, and documentation area, giving his men tangible tasks to focus on amid the supernatural horror surrounding them. Hayes worked mechanically, his movements robotic as he secured the perimeter. The once pragmatic corporal's eyes constantly darted to shadows between wrecked vehicles, his foundation visibly crumbling with each passing hour. "Water check," Jim announced, taking inventory. "We've got enough for 2 more days if we ration carefully." 2 days to document thousands of deaths, Wilson muttered, adjusting the static-filled radio. Not exactly a reasonable timeline. "We work with what we have," Jim replied with practiced steadiness. "Daniels, documentation status?" The private looked up from his notebook, dark circles under his feverishly bright eyes. "I've mapped the convoy pattern based on the diary. If we divide the highway into sectors—" "They're watching us," Hayes interrupted, his voice hollow. "Right now. Can't you feel them?" Everyone paused, scanning their surroundings. Each blackened hull seemed to harbor unseen observers. "Focus on the task, Hayes," Jim ordered without conviction. Hayes laughed, a brittle sound. "The task? You still think that matters?" He gestured wildly. "We're prisoners here, Sarge. Prisoners of the dead." "Stand down, Corporal." "They're in my head," Hayes continued, voice rising. "Every time I close my eyes, I see what they saw. The planes coming, the bombs falling. I feel them burning." Jim recognized the signs of accelerated combat stress. "Hayes, look at me. Focus on my voice." Hayes's eyes found Jim's, pupils dilated too wide, his gaze both present and absent. "I can hear them even when they're not screaming. They're talking to each other, planning something." "What are they planning?" Daniels asked, moving closer with his recorder. Jim shot him a warning look, but Hayes had already turned toward the private, suddenly hostile. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" Hayes snarled. "Your precious book, your recordings. You think this makes you special?" "I'm just trying to document." "Document?" Hayes spat. "You're feeding on their pain like some kind of vulture." "That's enough," Jim intervened, stepping between them. "No, it's not enough," Hayes whispered. "They want more. They want us to feel everything." Wilson approached cautiously. "Hayes, maybe you should rest. We can take over your watch." "Rest?" Hayes laughed again. "There's no rest here. They don't rest. Why should we?" "Wilson, get the medical kit," Jim decided. "We've got sedatives for emergencies." "No!" Hayes backed away, hand moving to his sidearm. "No drugs. I need to stay alert. They come when you're not paying attention." Jim kept his voice level, hands visible. "Rob, no one's going to force anything on you, but you need to calm down." Something shifted in Hayes's expression, a flicker of clarity. "Sarge, something's wrong with me. I can feel them. Pushing." "Fighting it is good. Focus on that. On us. On what's real." Hayes nodded shakily, hand moving from his weapon. "I just need some air. Just a few minutes alone." "No one goes anywhere alone. That's standing orders." 10 meters, Hayes pleaded. "Just to that truck over there. I'll stay in sight." Jim reluctantly agreed. 10 meters. Wilson, keep eyes on him." Hayes walked slowly toward a destroyed supply truck. Jim turned to Daniels. "How much have you documented?" "Everything I can," Daniels replied, holding up his notebook. "But it's not enough. The diary keeps changing." "Changing how?" "New entries appear. Testimonies from people who died here, details that weren't there before. It's like the book is being written by the dead themselves." A blood-curdling scream erupted. Hayes, staggering back from the truck, firing his sidearm at something only he could see. "Hayes, hold fire!" Jim shouted, drawing his weapon as he raced forward. Hayes continued shooting until his clip emptied. When the slide locked back, he threw the weapon aside and drew his combat knife. "Stay back!" he warned as Jim approached. "It's not him! It's one of them!" Jim realized Hayes wasn't seeing him at all. "Rob, it's me. It's Sergeant Carter." "Liar!" Hayes slashed the air between them. "I saw you die. I saw the bombs tear you apart." Wilson circled right, trying to flank Hayes. "He's hallucinating. The spirits must be showing him things." "Rob, listen to my voice. Whatever you're seeing, it's not real." Hayes lunged, knife arcing toward Jim's throat. Combat instinct took over. Jim sidestepped, caught Hayes' wrist, and took him to the ground. Wilson joined the struggle, helping disarm the thrashing soldier. "No!" Hayes screamed with inhuman strength. "You're dead! You're all dead!" Daniels appeared with restraints, and together they secured Hayes' wrists and ankles as he continued to thrash. "Get the sedative," Jim ordered. Daniels administered the injection with shaking hands. Gradually, Hayes' struggles weakened, though his face remained twisted in anguish even as his body went limp. "They're showing him the attack," Daniels said quietly, making him experience it from their perspective. "Why him?" Wilson asked. "Why not all of us?" Jim watched Hayes slip into unconsciousness. Because he resisted the most. Because he didn't want to witness. They carried Hayes back to camp, securing him thoroughly. The sun was setting, painting the highway blood red. "We need to accelerate the documentation," Jim said. "Whatever's happening, it's escalating." "We can't document the entire highway in a day," Wilson pointed out. But maybe we don't have to. The tablet, the ancient witness, they implied that we need to truly experience what happened here." Jim looked at Daniels. "Your theory about the spirits wanting us to see through their eyes. Hayes just proved you right." "So what do we do?" Wilson asked. "Let ourselves be possessed like Hayes?" Jim shook his head. "Not possessed, but we need to open ourselves to their testimony, controlled, on our terms." "Like a seance," Daniels suggested. "Something like that. We make contact deliberately instead of waiting for them to force their way in." The voices started again as darkness fell, now carrying distinct patterns, almost like language. "They're getting stronger," Wilson observed. "Or more desperate," Daniels suggested. "Maybe they know we're trying to help." Jim set the watch rotation and took first shift, positioning himself at the perimeter. The voices echoed like ghostly tides as he confronted memories he'd been suppressing. Panama and other moments when following orders had been an excuse to avoid moral complexity. "Is that why I'm here?" he whispered. "To face what I've ignored?" A soft voice answered from beside him. "Not just to face it, to bear witness." Jim turned to find a translucent middle-aged man in civilian clothes sitting next to him, his spectral body bearing terrible wounds. "You're from the bus," Jim stated with surprising calm. The ghost nodded. "I was a doctor in Kuwait City. When the invasion came, I tried to get my family out. We believed the Americans would recognize civilian vehicles." "I'm sorry," Jim said inadequately. Sorry doesn't restore life. But witness preserves memory. Memory demands justice. What kind of justice can there be for this? Truth, the ghost said simply. The first step toward justice is always truth. Hayes moaned in his sedated sleep. Your friend resists, the ghost observed. But resistance only makes the witnessing more painful. The highway will be heard, one way or another. The dead have no power except what the living give them through guilt or fear. The ghost flickered. Dawn approaches. Make your choice, Sergeant Carter. Witness willingly or suffer like your friend. The figure dissolved, leaving Jim with his decision. In the east, the faintest light heralded another day on the highway of death. A day that would either break them completely or lead them toward whatever resolution the dead demanded. Dawn broke over the highway of death, painting the destruction in harsh light. Jim hadn't slept, his mind filled with the ghost's words. Wilson and Daniels rose with practiced efficiency, while Hayes remained sedated, his face more relaxed now. "How is he?" Wilson asked, checking Hayes's pulse. "Stable. The sedative should wear off soon." Daniels was already reviewing his notes. The wailing stopped completely about an hour before sunrise. First time since we've been here. Jim nodded. His decision made during the night watch. "I need to tell you both something. I had a visitor last night. One of the spirits. We talked." Wilson and Daniels exchanged glances. "What did it want?" Wilson asked cautiously. "The same thing they all want. For us to witness, but on a deeper level than just documenting facts." Jim looked at each man. "I think we need to do what Hayes was fighting. Open ourselves to their experiences, voluntarily." "You want us to let them in?" Wilson's skepticism was evident. "After what happened to Hayes?" "Hayes fought it. That's why it overwhelmed him. The spirit said resistance makes it worse." Daniels nodded slowly. "It makes sense. They want empathy, not just observation. We'll take shifts. One person makes contact while the others monitor. At the first sign of distress, we break the connection." "And how exactly do we make contact?" Wilson asked. Jim glanced at the diary in Daniel's hands. "I think we already have the means. The diary, the tablet, the bus, they're all conduits." "I'll go first," Daniels volunteered. Jim shook his head. "Number, this was my decision. I go first." Hayes groaned, his eyes fluttering open. Confusion turned to panic as he realized he was restrained. "Easy, Rob," Jim moved to his side. "You're safe. We secured you for your own protection." Recognition dawned. "I attacked you. I thought you were one of them." "How much do you remember?" Jim asked, offering water. Hayes drank greedily. "Everything. I remember everything they showed me." His eyes filled with tears. "The people on that bus, Sarge, they were just families. Doctors, teachers, children." "I know." "We knew," Hayes continued. "Command knew there were civilians mixed in. The pilots reported it. But the orders came anyway. Neutralize all vehicles on the highway." He looked at Jim desperately. "We have to tell someone. We have to make it right." "We will," Jim promised. "But first we need to complete what we started here." He explained his plan to Hayes, whose initial reaction was terror. "No," Hayes shook his head. "You don't understand what it's like. They don't just show you. They make you feel everything. The fear, the pain, the burning. I understand the risk, but fighting made it worse for you. I'm going to accept what they show me." Hayes stared at him, then nodded. Then let me help. I've already seen. I might be able to guide you." Jim released Hayes from his restraints. The corporal sat up shakily, accepting more water and a ration bar. His hands trembled, but his eyes were clear. "How do we do this?" Wilson asked. Jim looked toward bus 17. "We start where they want us to start, with the strongest connection." The Humvee refused to start when they tried to drive to the bus. The radio emitted only static when Wilson attempted to check in with base. Their satellite phone displayed no signal despite the clear sky. "They're making sure we can't leave," Wilson observed. "Not until we do what they want." They moved as a unit to the destroyed bus, tense but resolved. The morning sun had already heated the blackened metal. "I need the diary," Jim said, extending his hand to Daniels. The private hesitated, then placed the leather-bound book in Jim's palm. "Be careful, Sarge." Jim approached slowly, diary in hand. The charred remains of the bus's occupants were still visible inside. He placed his free hand on the twisted metal frame. "I'm here to witness," he said aloud. "I'm ready to bear your truth." For several heartbeats, nothing happened. Then the diary grew warm, its pages turning of their own accord. Jim allowed the book to fall open to a specific entry. Though the text was in Arabic, he suddenly understood it perfectly. February 26, 1991. The evacuation proceeds in chaos. Military and civilian vehicles mixed together despite my protests. The Americans will not distinguish. I have seen their aircraft circling. Allah have mercy on us all. As Jim read, the world around him changed. The sunlight dimmed, replaced by headlights and distant fires. The destroyed bus transformed. Metal unbending, glass reforming, charred surfaces becoming whole. "Sarge?" Wilson's voice sounded distant. "I'm okay," Jim managed to reply. "It's working." The transformation completed, and Jim found himself inside the bus, not as an observer, but as a passenger. Families sat with meager possessions, faces tight with fear. Children whimpered while parents whispered false reassurances. At the front, the driver argued with someone outside. Jim understood their Arabic without difficulty. "We cannot go that way. The Americans are bombing the highway." "There is no other route," replied an Iraqi officer with Republican Guard insignia. "Follow the convoy. You will be safe." The driver turned back, his expression conveying what his words didn't. They had no choice. The bus lurched forward, joining a line of vehicles stretching as far as Jim could see. Military trucks and civilian cars intermingled in the desperate exodus. Through the windows, the Kuwaiti desert stretched dark under a star-filled sky. A man beside Jim wrote frantically in the familiar leather-bound diary. The civil defense officer documenting the convoy's composition, desperately hoping his records would matter. Hours passed in minutes. Children slept against their parents. Adults dozed fitfully. The convoy moved slowly, frequently stopping as vehicles broke down. Then came the sound that changed everything, the distant roar of aircraft engines. "They're coming!" someone shouted. The bus erupted in panic. "White flags!" the driver called. "Show the white flags!" Hands thrust makeshift white flags out of windows. Torn shirts, pillowcases, anything white. Jim found himself holding one, feeling the cloth between his fingers. The first explosions hit the front of the convoy. Even at a distance, the concussion rocked the bus. Children screamed. Parents prayed. The civil defense officer wrote faster. "They will see we are civilians," a woman insisted, clutching her infant. "The Americans are not barbarians." Jim wanted to warn them, but was merely a passenger in this memory, unable to change the past. The aircraft came closer, a 10 thunderbolts, their distinctive buzzsaw roar cutting through the night. "Get down!" the driver shouted. Jim felt himself pulled to the floor by the man next to him. The doctor he had spoken with the previous night. Parents covered children with their bodies. The first rounds hit with devastating precision. Metal tore, glass shattered, people screamed. Not the supernatural wailing he'd heard before, but the very human sounds of terror and agony. Jim felt it all. The initial shock, the searing pain as shrapnel tore through flesh, the heat as fires erupted, the suffocating smoke, the desperate prayers, the final moments as life ebbed away. Most of all, he felt their confusion, the inability to understand why this was happening. They had waved white flags. They were clearly civilians. Why hadn't the pilots seen? Why hadn't they cared? As darkness claimed the consciousness Jim had temporarily inhabited, one final image burned into his mind. The civil defense officer, fatally wounded but still writing, using his own blood when his pen ran dry, recording until his last breath. Witness this. Remember us. Jim gasped as reality snapped back. He found himself on his knees beside the destroyed bus, the diary clutched tight in white-knuckled hands. Wilson and Daniels knelt beside him, their faces etched with concern. Hayes stood back, his expression showing grim understanding. "Sarge, you with us?" Wilson asked, gripping his shoulder. Jim nodded, unable to speak immediately. His body remembered pain never inflicted on it. His lungs burned with smoke he hadn't inhaled. His eyes stung with tears for people he'd never met in life. "I saw everything," he finally managed. "Felt everything. They just wanted to escape. They thought the white flags would protect them." Daniels helped him to his feet. "What did you learn? Beyond what we already suspected?" Jim took a deep breath. The convoy was deliberately targeted. The civil defense officer was documenting the mixed composition specifically because he feared this would happen. He opened the diary, which now contained new entries. The officer's final thoughts recorded in what appeared to be dried blood. "We need to take this all the way to the top," Jim said, voice hardening. "This wasn't collateral damage. This was either criminal negligence or deliberate targeting of civilians." Wilson looked troubled. "That's a serious accusation, Sarge. Against our own command." "I know, but I gave my word to the dead. Truth first, then justice." Hayes approached. "There's something else, isn't there? Something you're not telling us." Jim hesitated, then nodded. "The spirits on this highway. They're not just from the Gulf War. The tablet showed us that. This place has seen death for centuries." "What are you saying?" Daniels asked. "I'm saying this isn't just about documenting one atrocity. It's about breaking a cycle." Jim gestured at the highway. "How many times has this happened? How many armies have passed through here, leaving their dead? How many commanders have classified civilian deaths as unfortunate but necessary?" The implications hung heavily. They were challenging how history itself recorded warfare. Hayes suddenly stiffened, eyes fixing on something behind Jim. "We have company." They turned to find dozens of translucent figures standing in silent witness around their camp. Men, women, children, all bearing the marks of violent death, all watching with expectant eyes. At the forefront stood the doctor, and beside him, the civil defense officer whose diary Jim held. "You have seen," the officer said, his voice carrying despite its ghostly nature. "Now you understand." Jim stepped forward. "Yes, and we'll make sure others understand too. Many will not wish to hear, the doctor warned. Your own people will resist this truth. Some will, Jim acknowledged, but not all. The truth has power. The officer gestured to the diary. My record is incomplete. There were others, hundreds of others, along this highway. Different stories, different voices, but the same end. We can't document them all, Jim said honestly. No, the officer agreed. But you can honor them all through those you do document. The tablet you found is the key, the officer said. It has absorbed the essence of every death on this highway for millennia. Through it, you can connect to all of us at once. That sounds dangerous, Wilson observed. It is, the doctor confirmed. The weight of so much death has driven many mad, but 4 of you, sharing the burden. He left the implication hanging. Jim looked at his men. It's your decision. I won't order this. Hayes spoke first. I've already seen the worst of it. If there's a way to make meaning from this horror, I'm in. Me too, Daniels said without hesitation. Wilson hesitated longest, then nodded. Someone needs to tell their story. Might as well be us. Jim turned back to the spirits. Tell us what to do. The officer pointed down the highway. Return to the ancient stone at sunset. Bring items from the dead, personal effects that connect to their humanity. Form a circle around the tablet. Let it speak through you. And then? Jim asked. And then you become witnesses, in the truest sense, the doctor said. Not just to what happened here 3 weeks ago, but to all who have died on this highway through the ages. The spirits began to fade in the strengthening sunlight. The officer was the last to disappear, his final words hanging in the air. Choose carefully what you bring to the ritual. Objects hold memories. Some are heavier than others. When they were alone again, the 4 soldiers stood processing what they had agreed to. Are we really doing this? Wilson finally asked. Some kind of supernatural ritual with an ancient tablet? You've seen what's happening here, Jim replied. We're past the point of conventional explanations. Daniels was already making notes. We need to collect personal items from different parts of the highway, create a representative sample. Not just items, Hayes said quietly. Memories, lives. That's what they want us to preserve. Not just facts about how they died, but who they were before death. Jim nodded. We split up, pairs only, no one goes alone, and gather what we need. Meet back here at midday to prepare for the ritual at sunset. As they dispersed, Jim found himself standing alone beside bus 17. The diary felt heavier now, weighted with responsibility. I will tell your story, he promised the empty bus. All of your stories, whatever it costs. The desert heat began to wane as the sun descended, casting long shadows from the ruined vehicles. Jim watched his men prepare for what lay ahead. They had spent the day gathering items as directed, personal effects from the dead that might connect them to the ritual. Status report, Jim said as they regrouped. Daniels laid out their collected items reverently. A child's singed teddy bear from bus 17, a family photograph in a cracked frame, dog tags from Iraqi soldiers, prayer beads, a wedding ring, a half-burned handwritten letter. Each item has a story, Daniels explained. I've documented what we could piece together about their owners. Hayes knelt beside the collection, touching a small metal toy car gently. Found this clutched in a child's hand. Couldn't have been more than 5 years old. Wilson nodded, but his expression remained troubled. I should tell you something. I've been reporting to command." The others looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" Jim asked. "When you were asleep." "I've been downplaying what we've found." Wilson's face was professionally detached. "Telling them we're experiencing stress reactions, hallucinations from heat and exhaustion." "You went behind our backs?" Hayes started forward, but Jim held up a hand. "Why?" Jim asked simply. "To protect us," Wilson replied. "If I told them what's really happening, they'd either think we've all lost our minds or—" He hesitated. "Or they'd send someone to make sure we never made it back to tell anyone what we've learned." Jim studied Wilson's face, finding no deception. "We proceed as planned, but after tonight, we're in this together. No more separate communications. Clear?" Wilson nodded. "Crystal, Sarge." The sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in deepening crimson. It was time. They gathered their collected items and moved toward the tablet, each man silent with his thoughts. Hayes carried the Iraqi officer's diary, having formed a connection with the man's desperate attempt to document truth amid chaos. The tablet waited exactly as they had left it, half buried in sand, ancient symbols pulsing with inner light in the fading day. "Form a circle around it," Jim instructed. "Place the items between yourselves and the stone." They positioned themselves at cardinal points, each setting down his gathered mementos. Jim completed the arrangement with a teddy bear, the most innocent reminder of what had been lost. "What now?" Wilson asked, his skepticism tempered by the unmistakable energy from the stone. "We open ourselves," Jim said simply. "No resistance, no fear. We witness." Daniels had his recorder ready, but set it aside after consideration. Some things shouldn't be recorded. Some things should only be carried. As the last light faded, the air changed. Not with a familiar temperature drop, but with sudden, oppressive heat. The sand beneath them vibrated, fine grains dancing in patterns mirroring the tablet symbols. "Join hands," Jim ordered, reaching out to Hayes and Wilson. The four men linked themselves in a circle, their collected items glowing faintly in the gathering darkness. The vibration intensified, becoming a low, harmonic hum that resonated in their bones. "Don't fight it," Jim reminded them as the pressure built. "Accept what comes." The tablet symbols flared with sudden brilliance. The sand began to move, not blown by wind, but stirring of its own accord, forming patterns mimicking the tablet's ancient script. Hayes gasped first. "They're coming," he whispered, his eyes rolling back. "All of them." Jim felt it next, a surge of foreign consciousness flooding his mind. Not one spirit, but hundreds, thousands, each carrying memories of life and death on this highway across centuries. Roman legionnaires dying of thirst, Ottoman soldiers ambushed by Bedouin raiders, British tanks burning under German air attacks, and most recently, the victims of Operation Desert Storm, military and civilian alike. "Jesus Christ!" Wilson choked out, tears streaming down his face. "So many, so many." Daniels had gone rigid, his mouth open in a silent scream as the weight of collective memory poured through him. His free hand traced symbols in the sand he couldn't possibly know. Jim fought to maintain some core of himself amid the flood, not just witnessing death, but experiencing the full measure of human lives cut short. Hopes, dreams, loves, fears, all preserved in the highway's memory. The tablet's glow intensified until it was painful to look at directly. Their gathered items began to disintegrate, not burning but breaking down into component elements, dust swirling to join the patterns forming around them. "Stay together!" Jim managed to shout as Hayes' grip weakened. "Don't let go!" but the pressure was becoming unbearable. The humming had evolved into a language beyond sound, pure emotion and memory transferred directly into their consciousness. Jim saw through 1,000 different eyes, felt death through 1,000 different bodies. A child watching fire rain from the sky, a soldier realizing his commanders had abandoned him, a mother using her body to shield her infant from bullets, an ancient traveler dying of wounds from highway bandits, watching the same stars overhead. The circle was breaking. Hayes collapsed first, falling backward into the sand. Wilson followed moments later, curling into a fetal position. "Daniels!" Jim called, still gripping the private's hand. But Daniels wasn't seeing him anymore. The young soldier stared upward at something beyond the physical world, his mouth forming words in languages he had never learned. "Witness, remember, carry." Daniels chanted, his voice overlaid with dozens of others. "The highway demands. The highway preserves." The tablet's glow suddenly concentrated into a beam that shot upward into the night sky, creating a pillar of light visible for miles. Within it, faces formed and dissolved, the dead appearing briefly before vanishing again. Jim felt his grip on Daniels slipping as the private was pulled physically toward the tablet. With a final surge of strength, Jim lunged forward, tackling Daniels away from the stone's influence. The connection broke with an audible crack. The light collapsed back into the tablet, which shattered into fragments that scattered across the sand. The humming stopped, replaced by profound silence. Jim lay gasping beside Daniels, who had gone completely limp. Hayes and Wilson remained where they had fallen, unmoving but breathing. "Report," Jim croaked. "Everyone report." "Still here, Sarge," Wilson managed after a moment, pushing himself up. "I think—" Hayes groaned, rolling onto his back. "Did it work? Are they satisfied?" Jim looked to Daniels, who hadn't responded. "Daniels? Mark?" The private's eyes slowly opened, but something was different about them. A depth that hadn't been there before, as if he was seeing multiple layers of reality simultaneously. "They're here," Daniels whispered. "All of them, inside us now." Jim helped him sit up. "What do you mean?" "The ritual," Daniels explained, his voice stronger but somehow altered. "It didn't release them. It connected us to them. Permanently." He touched his temple. "I can hear them, not wailing anymore, talking, remembering." Hayes nodded with sudden understanding. That's what they wanted all along. Not just witnesses to observe and report, but vessels to carry their memories forward. The implication slowly dawned on Jim. The ritual hadn't freed the spirits, it had transferred the burden of memory to the four of them. They had become living repositories for the highway's dead. "Can you stand?" Jim asked, helping Daniels to his feet. They gathered around the shattered remains of the tablet, now inert like ordinary stone. "The tablet was a containment vessel," Daniels said. "It held their memories, their experiences. Now we do." "What if we had all broken connection?" Wilson asked. "The spirits would have been released," Daniels replied with certainty. "Not just remembered, but unleashed, free to seek vengeance instead of witness." Jim felt the weight of what they'd done, what they'd prevented. "The roadblock, do you think it's gone?" "Only one way to find out," Hayes replied. They returned to camp to gather their equipment, moving with the dazed precision of men who had survived something beyond comprehension. None spoke of what they had individually experienced during the ritual. Some burdens were too personal to share. The Humvee started on the first try. Jim drove slowly back toward the roadblock that had prevented their departure earlier. Where the barrier had stood, the highway now lay clear. The sandbags, metal, and personal effects that had formed the blockade were gone, as if they had never existed. "It worked," Hayes murmured. "They're letting us leave." "Not letting us leave," Daniels corrected. "Sending us forward, with their stories." Jim drove cautiously past where the blockade had been, half expecting some new manifestation. But the highway remained clear, the night quiet except for the Humvee's engine. "What do we do now, Sarge?" Wilson asked as they continued north. Jim considered carefully. They carried evidence, the diary, recordings, photographs. But more importantly, they carried memories that weren't their own. "We tell the truth," Jim said finally, "whatever it costs." As they drove away from the highway of death, the screaming did not follow. Instead, a profound silence accompanied them. Not the absence of sound, but the quiet respect of thousands who had finally found their voice through the 4 soldiers who had dared to listen. In the rearview mirror, Jim thought he saw figures standing along the highway, translucent forms watching their departure with solemn dignity. The highway receded behind them, but its memories remained, not as haunting cries, but as a sacred trust. They were no longer just soldiers completing a mission. They were witnesses carrying an ancient burden, the truth of what happens when history is written by the victors and the dead are denied their voice. Dawn was still hours away, but for the first time since they had entered the highway of death, Jim Carter felt something like hope. Not for himself. He knew the path ahead would be difficult, but for the stories they now carried. Stories that would no longer remain buried in the desert sand. The extraction point appeared on the horizon as dawn broke, a temporary forward operating base marked by concertina wire and canvas tents. Jim slowed the Humvee, studying the outpost with new eyes. After their experiences, the military encampment seemed simultaneously familiar and foreign. "They'll never believe us," Hayes said, breaking their long silence. "It doesn't matter if they believe," Daniels replied, his voice carrying that strange new resonance. "The truth doesn't require belief to remain true." Wilson shifted uncomfortably. "Easy for you to say. You're not the one who's going to be writing the official report." Jim stopped the vehicle 100 meters from the base perimeter. "Before we go in, we need to be clear on our approach. What happened on that highway stays between us until we reach the right channels." "And what are the right channels, Sarge?" Hayes asked. "Because I'm pretty sure we communed with the spirits of civilians killed in an airstrike isn't going to play well up the chain of command." Jim turned to face his men. "We focus on the evidence first. The diary, the recordings, the photos, all documenting the civilian casualties and the mixed composition of the convoy. That's solid ground." "And the rest?" Wilson pressed. "We keep to ourselves for now, at least until we understand better what happened to us." They nodded, though Daniel seemed distracted, his attention repeatedly drawn to something only he could perceive. Jim followed Daniel's gaze, but saw only empty desert. "Who's gathering?" "The witnesses," Daniels explained. "Not just from the highway, others, watching to see if we'll honor our promise." The radio crackled to life, their first clear transmission since entering the highway of death. "Unidentified vehicle approaching from south. Identify yourself immediately." Jim picked up the handset. "This is Recon Unit Delta, returning from Patrol Sector 9. Requesting entry and immediate debrief with commanding officer." A pause then. "Delta, you're 24 hours overdue. Stand by for escort." A Humvee emerged from the base, military intelligence insignia on its side. Jim recognized this wasn't standard protocol. "Intelligence officers," he noted. "They've been looking for us." The escort vehicle pulled alongside them, and a Major Jim didn't recognize signaled for them to follow. They proceeded through the checkpoint in silence, parking near the command tent. As they exited their vehicle, Jim noted the subtle positioning of armed guards around the area. Someone had flagged their return as potentially problematic. The Major approached, expression carefully neutral. "Sergeant Carter, I'm Major Lawrence, MI Liaison. Your team has caused quite a stir by disappearing for 24 hours in an active theater." "We encountered a situation that required thorough investigation, sir," Jim replied formally. "Request immediate debrief with Colonel Hadley." "Colonel Hadley has been reassigned," Lawrence informed them. "I'll be handling your debrief." Jim exchanged glances with his men. Hadley's sudden reassignment raised immediate red flags. "With respect, sir, our findings may require higher clearance," Jim persisted. Lawrence's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I assure you, Sergeant, my clearance is sufficient. Now, I'll need your patrol logs, recordings, and any materials collected during your extended investigation." Jim made a quick decision. "Wilson, retrieve our gear for inspection. Daniels, Hayes, secure the vehicle." His men understood the unspoken instruction. Wilson would bring only the standard patrol logs, while Daniels and Hayes would ensure the diary and recordings remained concealed. As his team dispersed, Jim felt a sudden electrical charge in the air. Behind Major Lawrence, he glimpsed a translucent figure, the civil defense officer whose diary they carried. "They will bury the truth," the ghost warned, audible only to Jim. "They already know what happened. They are protecting those who gave the orders." "Sergeant, are you unwell?" Lawrence asked, noting Jim's distraction. "Just tired, sir. It was an eventful patrol." The debrief room was a small, windowless tent with recording equipment and a table with 5 chairs. 2 other officers waited inside, a captain from Judge Advocate General's Corps and a lieutenant with intelligence insignia. Jim's unease deepened. This wasn't a standard patrol debrief. It was closer to an interrogation. His team was directed to seats on one side, while the 3 officers took positions opposite. Major Lawrence placed a folder on the table. "What proceedings would those be, sir?" Jim asked directly. Lawrence ignored the question. "Let's start with your patrol route. You were assigned to sweep Highway 80 for 20 kilometers and report any significant findings. Your last check-in placed you at the 10-kilometer mark, after which you went silent. Explain." Jim felt Hayes tense beside him. The JAG captain watched them with clinical interest. "We encountered unusual phenomena that warranted further investigation," Jim began carefully. "Communications were intermittent due to atmospheric conditions." "What phenomena?" Lawrence pressed. "Evidence of civilian casualties mixed with military targets on the highway of death. Specifically, we located a civilian bus, number 17 according to Iraqi transportation records, carrying families evacuating from Kuwait City." The intelligence lieutenant made a note, expression unchanged. "Civilian casualties on Highway 80 have been documented in the official after-action reports," Lawrence stated dismissively. "This hardly explains your extended absence." "With respect, sir," Daniels interjected, his voice carrying that strange resonance. "What's been documented represents a fraction of the reality. We found evidence that command knew civilians were mixed with military vehicles and ordered strikes anyway." The lights in the tent flickered. The recording equipment emitted a high-pitched whine. Jim could see his breath forming clouds in the air, though none of the officers seemed to notice the change. "Private Daniels," the JAG captain spoke for the first time, "are you making an allegation of a war crime?" Before Daniels could respond, Hayes slammed the diary onto the table. This is our evidence, the personal record of an Iraqi civil defense officer who documented the convoy composition. He noted specifically that American aircraft had visual confirmation of civilian vehicles before the attack began. The intelligence lieutenant reached for the diary, but Hayes kept his hand firmly on it. "There's more," Wilson added. "Recordings, photographs, testimonies we gathered from survivors." Lawrence's expression hardened. "What survivors?" "The attack was 3 weeks ago. No one could have survived that long in the desert." "Not living survivors," Jim said quietly. "The dead told us their stories." A heavy silence fell. The officers exchanged glances, mixing concern with calculation. "Sergeant Carter," Lawrence finally said, "I think your team has been affected by combat stress. We'll have medical examine all of you immediately." "We're not suffering from stress, sir," Jim replied evenly. "We experienced something on that highway that defies conventional explanation, but the evidence we gathered is real and verifiable." The ghosts had multiplied, filling the small tent with their silent presence. Among them now were older spirits, soldiers from different eras, civilians from ancient times, all united in their vigil. Lawrence leaned forward. "Let me be perfectly clear, Sergeant. Your official report will state that you investigated wreckage on Highway 80, found nothing of strategic significance, and experienced communications difficulties due to weather conditions. You will not mention civilian targeting, diaries, or conversations with the dead." His voice dripped with contempt at the last words. "That would be falsifying an official report, sir," Jim pointed out. "That would be following orders, Sergeant," Lawrence countered. "Orders that come from much higher than this tent." The JAG captain shifted uncomfortably. "Major, perhaps we should—" "Captain, secure those materials," Lawrence interrupted, pointing to the diary. "This debrief is concluded. Medical will evaluate Delta Team immediately." As the captain reached for the diary, the air in the tent compressed. The recording equipment sparked violently. The canvas walls began to ripple despite the absence of wind. And then the haunted silence erupted into a cacophony of voices. Not distant wails, but immediate, deafening accusations from everywhere at once. The officers recoiled, hands instinctively covering their ears. "What the hell is that?" Lawrence demanded, rising. The spirits had become fully visible, their forms solidifying as the voices intensified. The tent canvas began to tear, allowing harsh sunlight through growing gaps. "They won't let you bury this," Jim said, his voice somehow audible above the cacophony. "They've waited too long to be heard." The intelligence lieutenant bolted for the exit, only to find his path blocked by ghostly figures. The JAG captain remained frozen, face drained of color. Major Lawrence maintained his composure, though sweat poured down his face. This is some kind of trick, some psychological operation. Hayes laughed bitterly. "That's right, sir. We rigged the entire highway of death with special effects just to sell this story." The diary began turning its own pages, stopping at an entry written in dried blood. Lawrence stared at it, then at the 4 soldiers. The major's eyes suddenly rolled back, his body going rigid. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, layered with dozens of others, including the distinctive accent of the civil defense officer. "I documented everything," Lawrence said, his mouth moving unnaturally. "The orders came through clear channels. All vehicles on Highway 80 are to be considered hostile, no exceptions. I protested. I reported the civilian presence. The response, collateral damage, is acceptable." The JAG captain stood, his professional demeanor cracking. "This is impossible." "No more impossible than bombing a bus full of children," the possessed major continued, eyes completely white. "No more impossible than calling it a clean war while we burned alive." Lawrence's body convulsed, then slumped forward. When he raised his head again, he was himself, shaken, pale, but free of the possession. What just happened?" he gasped, looking wildly around. The spirits remained visible, but the cacophony had subsided to a low murmur. The civil defense officer stepped forward, his ghostly form now as solid-looking as any living person. "For centuries, the highway of death has collected the forgotten victims of war, those classified as acceptable losses, those erased from official records, those whose names were never recorded." He gestured to the hundreds of spirits now visible. "We have chosen these 4 to carry our testimony forward. You cannot silence them without silencing us all." Lawrence stared at the apparition, his worldview visibly crumbling. "This isn't possible." "Neither was what happened on that highway," Jim countered. "Targeting civilians isn't just a war crime. It's a betrayal of everything we're supposed to stand for." The JAG captain suddenly stepped forward. "I want to see all the evidence, officially, on record." Lawrence turned to him in disbelief. "Captain Turner, you can't." "With respect, Major," Turner interrupted. "JAG exists to uphold military law, not cover up potential violations." He looked at Jim. "I'll take full responsibility for this investigation, Sergeant, whatever the consequences." The spirits began to fade, though their presence remained palpable. The civil defense officer nodded in approval. "This is just the beginning," he told Jim. "The testimony must reach beyond these tents, beyond your military." Jim understood. The ritual had bound them to this task permanently. They would never be free of the highway's influence until the full truth was acknowledged. "We'll need protection," Jim told Captain Turner. "There will be people who want this buried at any cost." Turner nodded grimly. "I know, but I also know we can't build peace on hidden atrocities." He turned to Lawrence. "Major, you have 2 choices. Join this investigation officially, or I report your attempted obstruction up the chain." Lawrence's face contorted with conflicting emotions before settling on resignation. "You have no idea what you're starting," he warned. "No," Jim agreed. "But we know what we're ending." The silence. The spirits began to fade completely, their purpose temporarily fulfilled. The voices stopped, leaving an aftermath of ringing ears and shaken personnel outside the damaged tent. Daniels collected the diary. "They'll be with us always now," he said quietly to Jim, "watching, waiting for us to complete our task." Jim nodded, feeling the weight of thousands of memories that weren't his own. The ritual had changed them fundamentally. They had become living archives of atrocity and remembrance, bridges between the dead and the living. "We made a promise on that highway," he reminded his team. "No matter what comes next, we honor it." As Captain Turner began organizing the formal documentation of their evidence, Jim stepped outside the ruined tent. Personnel stared at Delta Team with mixtures of fear, confusion, and awe. Behind them all, visible only to Jim and his men, the highway of death stretched like a spectral ribbon across the desert. Not just the modern road they had patrolled, but all its incarnations through history, populated by the countless dead who had found their voice through 4 reluctant witnesses. The haunted echoes had been silenced, replaced by something more powerful. Testimony that could not be ignored, truth that would not remain buried in the desert sand. Dawn painted the horizon gold as Jim Carter sat alone outside his tent. 4 days had passed since their return. Days filled with debriefings, medical examinations, and isolation from other personnel. Sleep eluded them all. Whenever Jim closed his eyes, borrowed memories flooded his mind. A Roman merchant watching bandits approach, an Iraqi mother feeling explosions through a bus floor, a British soldier choking on dust as his vehicle burned. "Morning, Sarge," Wilson approached with coffee. "Any sleep?" Jim shook his head. Hayes finally dozed off. Daniels is still transcribing. Since their return, Daniels had filled 3 notebooks with accounts from voices only he could hear clearly, becoming their primary conduit to the dead. "Turner wants to see us at 0800, Jim said. "The report goes up today." "You think it'll make a difference?" Wilson asked. "It has to," Jim replied, uncertainty in his voice. "Otherwise, what was it all for?" The base stirred to life around them, personnel carefully avoiding their quarantine area. Rumors had spread: the torn tent, unexplained voices, electrical disturbances. "The spirits are quiet this morning," Wilson observed. Jim nodded. Since their return, ghosts had maintained a constant presence, visible only to Delta Team. Today, they were absent. Hayes emerged, eyes bloodshot but focused. Daniels finished another notebook, getting accounts from the Iran-Iraq war now. Highway 80 saw heavy fighting then too. "The highway remembers everything," Jim murmured. "That's what scares me," Hayes admitted. "How much more can we hold? We're just 4 guys. There are centuries of death stored in that place." A jeep approached with Captain Turner. "Change of plans. Command wants to see you all. Now." "Something wrong with the report?" Jim asked. "Let's just say there's been significant interest from above. Very above." They collected Daniels, who emerged clutching his notebook, eyes distant. The jeep took them to the command center, where General Mitchell waited with Major Lawrence and 3 intelligence officers. "Sergeant Carter," Mitchell nodded. "Be seated." As they sat, Jim noticed the spirits materializing around the room. The civil defense officer stood behind Mitchell, translucent eyes fixed on the proceedings. "I've reviewed Captain Turner's report and your evidence," Mitchell began. "Also, Major Lawrence's assessment of your mental states. Before we continue," he added, "I need clarity on your allegations. You believe civilians were knowingly targeted during the Highway 80 operation, and this information suppressed?" "That's correct, sir," Jim confirmed. "The diary and recordings provide documentary evidence." "And you expect us to believe you communicated with spirits who showed you visions?" Mitchell pressed. The lights pulsed gently. Papers stirred without wind. "We're not asking you to believe that part," Jim replied carefully. "The physical evidence stands on its own." "But you believe it?" Mitchell insisted. "All 4 of you?" "We experienced something that defies conventional explanation," Jim answered. "But our testimony regarding civilian casualties is based on verifiable evidence." Mitchell studied them while ghostly figures accumulated behind him. "What you're suggesting has profound implications for how the entire Gulf War will be remembered." "Truth often does, sir," Jim responded. Colonel Hargrove cleared his throat. "The psychological impact of combat combined with extreme conditions—" "We've all been medically cleared," Wilson interrupted. "No signs of conditions that might cause hallucinations." "And yet you claim to see ghosts," Lawrence interjected, hand trembling as he reached for water. Hayes leaned forward. "What we saw is irrelevant to the facts. Civilians died after surrendering. Someone gave that order." "I've been authorized to offer an alternative," Mitchell said after a silence. "Honorable discharges for all 4 of you, with full benefits. In return, all materials related to your findings would become classified." "You want us to walk away," Jim translated. I want to prevent unnecessary damage based on incomplete information, Mitchell countered. Suddenly, the satellite system activated itself. A senior officer appeared on screen. "General Mitchell," he acknowledged. "I've been listening." Mitchell stood. "General Westfield, sir. We weren't expecting your involvement." "Is Delta Team present?" Westfield asked. "Yes, sir." Westfield's gaze found Jim. "Sergeant Carter, I've reviewed everything. What do you want to come from this?" Jim felt the weight of thousands of memories pressing against his consciousness. Justice, sir. Acknowledgement of what happened. Truth in the official record. And if that truth damages the coalition, undermines support for future operations, then we deal with those consequences honestly, Jim replied. Lies don't stay buried. The highway of death has been collecting its dead for centuries, and sooner or later, those voices find a way to be heard. After a silence, Westfield announced, "There will be a full investigation at the highest level. However, it will not be public yet. There are diplomatic considerations that must be balanced against accountability." "The dead have waited long enough," Hayes said quietly. "Yes, they have," Westfield acknowledged. "But justice rushed is often justice denied." "And Delta Team?" Jim asked. "What happens to us?" "You'll be reassigned separately. Special projects under my direct authority. Your unique experiences may prove valuable in ways we don't yet understand." The implication was clear. They would be monitored, studied, perhaps utilized for their connection to the dead. "And the highway?" Daniels asked. "Already secured," Westfield replied. "A research team is examining the tablet fragments. Whatever happened to you wasn't entirely unprecedented. There are records of similar incidents throughout history." This revelation chilled Jim. The military had known about the highway's properties all along. Later, back at their tent, the men spoke in hushed tones. "They're splitting us up," Hayes observed. "Containing the situation?" "Or protecting the evidence," Wilson countered. "If something happens to one of us—" "The others still carry the memories," Jim finished. Daniels looked up from his notebook. "The spirits are satisfied. Not completely, but enough. The silence now isn't emptiness, it's anticipation." "So what happens to us?" Hayes asked. "We just go our separate ways, carrying this inside us?" "We carry their legacy," Jim said firmly. "We remain witnesses. That's what the ritual bound us to." As they prepared for separation, Jim stepped outside, gazing toward where the highway of death lay beyond the horizon. The doctor from Bus 17 materialized beside him. "It's just the beginning," the ghost said. "The highway has chosen well." "Will we ever be free of this?" Jim asked. "Would you want to be? To forget what you've witnessed would dishonor why you witnessed it." Jim understood. The ritual hadn't just made them vessels for memory. It had transformed them into bridges between history and justice. As the ghost faded, Jim felt a profound silence descend. Not absence, but presence filled with expectation. The highway's haunted echoes had been replaced by something more enduring, the persistent voice of truth that would not be silenced again.